So we're in this series called Habits, and we've been basically looking since the beginning of the year at how God wants us to be godly. So Scripture tells us that He wants us to be holy as He is holy. It's repeated in the Old Testament in Leviticus a few times. We read it in the New Testament in 1 Peter. That we are called to be holy as He is holy. We are told in Hebrews 12 to strive for holiness. We're told in Romans 8 that God has predestined us to be conformed to the image of His Son. He wants us to be like Jesus. And so in 1 Timothy 4, we have this verse that tells us that we are to train ourselves, to discipline ourselves for godliness. The point being that if we don't train ourselves, if we don't discipline ourselves, without those things in our life, without habits that are these regular patterns, we are likely to drift. It's just what happens with us as humans. If we are not intentionally investing in habits and disciplines that lead us to God, then we will drift away from God and more towards the things of the world. Paul says in his letter to the Romans, don't conform to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. He's saying, you will naturally drift this way if you are not intentional about being transformed, if you're not intentional about your mind being renewed. There's a reality that we actually have to kind of rewire our brains, and our synapses need to kind of be retold how they're supposed to fire. Oh, I've got a doctor. I'm probably using the wrong terminology, but the principle is there, that we need to actually do things intentionally to lead us in a godly direction, because our earthly tendency is to drift in the opposite direction. And that's why we've been talking about pursuing, developing, maturing, and growing in habits, spiritual disciplines. We've talked about Bible study and Bible reading and study. We've talked about prayer and fasting. We've talked about silence and solitude that Pastor Matt helped us with. We've talked about service last week, which Sarah looked at. A few weeks ago, we looked at worship. In a moment, don't fire it just yet, Bonnie. I'm going to talk about something else. But essentially, today I'm going to wrap up this series. Now, the reality is a series on spiritual disciplines could last a lot longer. We could keep going for several months. Richard Foster in Celebration of Discipline identifies at least 13 different disciplines. Dallas Willard in The Spirit of Disciplines discusses 23. Like, if we were going week by week, it would take us quite a while to go through. Now, we've actually covered 7 of them in the last 5 weeks. I'm going to cover another 2 today. But then next week we've got a family service that we're doing because it's family weekend, and then at the end of February we have what is our annual 5 for 5 Sunday. If you are new to Numa and you haven't experienced that before, we're going to have 5 of our Numa family each come and speak for 5 minutes. And so those 5 people are already busy working on that. I'm working with them to try and make sure that they're ready for that. But it's always a great time for us as a church family to do that together, and a great opportunity to encourage one another in that. And then in March, we're moving on to a new series called The Rabbi's Apprentice, which I'm really looking forward to. I think I say that every time we're planning a new series, but genuinely that's one I've been thinking about for quite some time. I'm really looking forward to doing that. So today, we're wrapping up this habit series, and we're looking at stewardship. It's one of those words that probably isn't the kind of topic you want to finish a series on. It's a word that for some people might seem a little bit rude. You don't want to hear that word in church. Maybe you automatically think that stewardship means that we're going to be talking about money this morning, and that can ring alarm bells for people when the churches start talking about money. But I came across what I thought was a rather amusing anecdote, and I wanted to share with you. So there was this church that wanted to try and encourage everyone possible to come together on the same Sunday. So typically, we'll have some people here one Sunday and some people are away and all of that. So they decided, we're going to try and get everyone together on the same Sunday. So they decided to do a no excuses Sunday. And this is what they put out in their advertisement for No Excuses Sunday. Come to No Excuses Sunday. Cots are going to be placed in the lobby for those who say, Sunday is my only day to sleep in. Lounge chairs are going to be available for those who find the pews too hard. Eye drops are going to be available for those who have tired eyes from watching too much TV late on Saturday night. Blankets are going to be provided for those who find the church too cold. And fans will be provided for those who find the church too hot. Ear defenders will be available for those who think the music is too loud, and hearing aids will be available for those who think the preaching is too quiet. Scorecards will be available for those who wish to list the hypocrites who are present. Relatives will be in attendance for those who like to spend Sundays with their family. Pre-packed meals will be available after service for those who can't normally come because they have to cook dinner. Hairdressers will be available for those who have to wash their hair. Doctors and nurses will be on hand for those who plan to be sick. Christmas poinsettias and Easter lilies will adorn the stage for those who have never seen a church without them. Trees, flowers, and wild grasses will line the aisles for those who like to see God in nature. And we will distribute stamp out stewardship buttons for those who feel the church is always asking for money. I'm hoping that none of us kind of relate to that. I'm not even convinced that that would be a true story. It's probably just a bad sermon illustration. The reality is for us, as I was thinking back, it's been about 3.5 years since we planted Numa.Church, and I don't think we have ever done a teaching on giving. We've talked about it in passing, but we've never actually done a sermon on giving. And today isn't actually a sermon on giving specifically either. If giving is an outworking of it for you, then that's between you and God. And if God is stirring you in that way, then I encourage you to be obedient to how he's stirring you. But what I really want to look at today is this spiritual principle that informs a spiritual practice of good stewardship. I actually think that stewardship, in terms of biblical stewardship, is a discipline that stands at odds with our culture. It's something that honors God, that recognizes a truth that our society and our culture try to deny and seemingly have long forgotten. So I'm going to pray, and then we're going to dive into the teaching. So Father, would you bring your word to life this morning? I know that your word, in terms of the written word, is a living and active word, but as I speak, God, the things that you've given me to speak, would you bring that alive in some way that it speaks to us, God? Not that it would be my words necessarily, but that people would receive your words, what you want to say this morning. Give us an openness to hear what you have to say to each of us, that we might then be able to act and live in a way that honors you. In Jesus' name, amen. So I want to start with some really simple questions. So by show of hands, who here owns a watch? Okay. Who here owns a phone? Who owns a dining table? Who owns a car? Who owns a house? Probably fewer of us. Some of you. Well done. If you own a house these days, congratulations. I've long given up on that aspiration. So I want to try and help us. I'm sure you're going to go, what was that about? And I will come back to that in just a moment. Okay, so I want to try and help us grasp this spiritual principle that I've just mentioned stands at complete odds with our culture and society. And the principle is this: it all belongs to God. There's a quote I came across by Tom Gardner. Now, Pastor Tom Gardner is a friend of ours. I know there's others in the room that know Pastor Tom. He used to pastor Sunshine Hills Foursquare Church over in Delta. He's now involved in the Foursquare Leadership and Enrichment and Development Program. Thank you. And I haven't actually been able to verify whether this quote that I found is this Tom Gardner or whether it's just another Tom Gardner. But Tom Gardner wrote this: the basis of stewardship is the recognition that God owns everything and we own nothing. So let me ask you again, who owns a watch? No one? God owns a watch. God owns 1 million watches, yes. So you've got the idea, right? We tend to think of things that we own, but here's the principle: it all belongs to God. Our time, our phones, our dining tables, our cars, our homes, all belongs to God. God owns everything, we own nothing. And just to back this up, this principle is entirely biblical. First Chronicles 29:12. David prays to God and he says, wealth and honor come from you. In verse 14, I'm going to skip through these quite quickly, he acknowledges everything comes from you. And we've given you only what comes from your hand in verse 16. So this is all the same prayer. Just in case you're wondering, well, it's come from God, but it's now ours. Lord our God, all this abundance that we've provided comes from you, and all of it belongs to you. So yes, God gives it, in a sense, to us, that we can then do other things with it, but it all belongs to God. It all belongs to him. Psalm 50 is a prophetic psalm. The writer Asaph begins, the mighty one God, the Lord, speaks. And then he says this in verses 9 to 12 of Psalm 50. This is what God says. Okay, I have no need of a bull from your stall or of goats from your pens. For every animal of the forest is mine and the cattle on 1,000 hills. I know every bird in the mountains. The insects in the fields are mine. If I were hungry, I would not tell you, for the world is mine and all that is in it. All belongs to God. To Job, God says, whatever is under the whole heaven, everything under heaven, is mine. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 26, Paul quotes Psalm 24, verse 1. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it. It all belongs to God. And it's so important that we get hold of this truth because everything in the world is telling us the opposite of this. Okay? The world is screaming that it doesn't all belong to God. It belongs to us. And so the world is telling us, accumulate wealth for yourself. Store things up. Accumulate possessions. Buy the newest watch. Buy the newest phone. Buy the newest sneakers. Buy a new car. Buy a house. Buy a bigger house. The world is saying, get stuff for yourself. Because the world is saying, you get to own it. It gets to be yours. But the principle that we have to grasp as Christians is it all belongs to God. Including the immaterial things like our time. Have you ever noticed how both time and money are things that we spend? We spend our time doing one thing or another, and we spend our money buying one thing or another. Sometimes we spend our time earning the money that we need in order to spend our time doing the things that we enjoy doing, like our hobbies and our pastimes and eating out and doing travel. I'm not saying these things are wrong. It's just interesting to me that time and money are things that we spend. They're both resources that are limited. They're both resources that God gives us and entrusts us with. The world tells us that our time is ours, so you can spend your time on yourself. Rest up, watch some TV, scroll through socials, take a holiday, take a vacation. Let's put it in. And it's not that those things are wrong, but we just have to watch the mindset that is behind it because the Bible tells us it all belongs to God. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it. But also that following line, the world and all who live in it. What does that mean for us? It means that actually we belong to God. Our lives belong to God. That means our lives are not actually our own to use as we choose. Our lives and the time that we've been given is something that God has entrusted us with, but it all belongs to Him. And the question is, how are we going to use it? That's why we're going to talk about stewardship this morning, what it means to steward our lives and our time and our money and our resources well. One pastor says this: if the church is to reclaim its spiritual health, we have to shred the arthritic view of what we do with our possessions and our time and our talent, and instead adopt a biblical stewardship that literally bows before the throne and says, God, use me and whatever you have placed in my hands for your glory. Biblical stewardship is a matter of surrender, and it's easy for us to say, I surrender it all to you, God. It's easy for us to sing that because the words go up on the screen, so we just sing it. But actually, it's much harder to live it out because it is so countercultural for us. So I want to start by thinking about our stewardship of time. If you have a Bible, you can turn to John 17. Jesus knows that ultimately the time has come for him to go to the cross. And he has just shared the Last Supper with his disciples. He's given them a new commandment to love one another as he has loved them. He's promised them the Holy Spirit. He's spoken to them about the importance of remaining and abiding in him. And then in the Garden of Gethsemane, he prays. And in verses 1 to 4 of John 17, this is what he prays. Father, the hour has come. Glorify your Son, that your Son, talking about himself, may glorify you. For you granted him authority over all people, that he might give eternal life. This is what Jesus came to do, to give eternal life to all those you've given him. Now, this is eternal life, Jesus says, that they know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom you have sent. Then he says this, I've brought you glory on earth by finishing the work that you gave me to do. The English Standard Version says, I've glorified you having accomplished the work that you gave me to do. The New Living Translation, by completing the work you gave me to do. And it's like whatever translation you read, it's almost like Jesus is saying, my time has come, but I know that I have used my time well. With the time that you gave me, God, I have accomplished everything that you asked me to do. And I read something like that, and I wonder if we knew that our time was done today, would we be able to say the same? Would we be able to stand before God and say, yeah, I've used the time that you've given me well? Or might we be tempted to kind of go, I know that some of the time you gave me I used well. I know that some of the time I used for you. But I possibly squandered some of the time on things that weren't necessarily the best use of that time. Maybe I wasted some time binging on Netflix. Maybe I wasted some time scrolling through socials endlessly more than I should. I'm not trying to condemn us. I just want us to think, like realistically and honestly, about how we use the time that God has given us. And it's interesting because Paul tells us in his letter to the church in Rome, each of us will give an account of ourselves to God. And again, I don't say that to scare us. I just find it very sobering to think I'm actually going to stand before the throne of God one day. And yes, it's a throne of grace, but I am going to have to give account. And part of that will be, how have I used the time that God gave me? Time is possibly our most valuable resource. There's a few things I want us to recognize. Time is short. James 4:14, you are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Time is fleeting. Psalm 39:4. Show me, Lord, my life's end and the number of my days. Let me know how fleeting my life is. Time is uncertain. Proverbs 27 verse 1, don't boast about tomorrow, for you do not know what a day may bring. Time is limited. John 9 verse 4, Jesus said, as long as it's day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. And in one sense, Jesus was making a very practical observation that because they didn't have streetlights, the work that he was to do was limited to daylight hours. But I actually believe that he was acknowledging the very limited nature of the time that we have and the importance of doing the work that God has given us while we have the time that he's given us. not procrastinating, not delaying, not getting distracted. This recognition that time is limited. Psalm 139:16 tells us God numbers our days. Job 1:21 tells us that he gives life and he takes it away. Our time is limited. But the Bible also makes it very clear that our time is God-given. Acts 17:25, he puts the very breath in our lungs. The time that we have here on earth is God-given. We don't know how long that is going to be. We've had family friends who have sadly been taken what feels like way too early, but very suddenly. We don't know how much time we have, but it is a gift from God. It's limited, it's short, it's fleeting, it's uncertain, but it is a gift from God. We're going to throw up a picture. This is called a chronophage. Has anyone ever seen one of these before? There's like 3 or 4 of them in the world. And they were developed by a scientist called Dr. John Taylor. This particular one is just outside, I can't remember which college it is, but it's one of the colleges at Cambridge University back in the UK. And it's about 2 meters wide. The grasshopper on the top is about 1.5 meters long. And Dr. John Taylor has this fascination with time. And this is an incredibly accurate timepiece. It's kind of hard to look at it and read what the time is, but there is a way of reading the time on this thing. But the point of the chronophage is that although it is extremely accurate, it actually portrays time in a very fluid, relative, and uncertain manner. So the pendulum at the bottom slows down and speeds up and then stops, just completely erratically, so that you don't have no sense of actually what is happening with time. There's blue LEDs that circle the outer edge of the circular part in the middle. And sometimes they're racing fast, and sometimes they'll slow down, and they'll speed up, and they'll slow down, and then they'll go backwards, and they'll go... And just to completely mess with any sense of what is actually happening with time. The only thing that is consistent is that every minute, the jaw of the grasshopper opens wider and wider and wider and wider until on the 59th second of every minute, it chomps down suddenly as if to say time is being eaten up and never to be got back. And Dr. John Taylor developed it purely to show us the uncertainty and the limited nature of time. Our time is a gift from God, but it is limited and it is uncertain. And so we need to steward it well. So I want to ask you, how are you stewarding the time that God has given you? How are you spending the time that God has given you? Are you pursuing his plans? Are you carrying out his kingdom call on your life? Or are you spending your time more on yourself? Are you stewarding and using the time that God has entrusted to you, investing it in his kingdom? Or are you investing it more in the world? It's interesting, and this is just a quick aside, but after the fool, the person that is most berated and looked down upon in the book of Proverbs is the sluggard. The one who wastes away time, not really accomplishing anything with the time he's been given. And so I want to encourage us. Let's not be like the sluggard, wasting time away. Let's not be like some of the other characters that we find in the Bible who use their time trying to just store wealth and build their own fame and renown. Our time is limited and uncertain, and it's been entrusted to us that we might use it for kingdom purposes. So let's train ourselves to be disciplined with our time, that we might become more like Jesus, that actually when we do stand before the throne, we will be able to say, I used my time well. I completed the work that you gave me to do. Let's move now on to stewardship of finances. And by that, I mean like our money, our possessions, all those kind of material resources. Because I want to just recognize that we are entrusted with time, but we are also entrusted with material resource. And again, just as we go into this, I would want to remind us of this principle. It all belongs to God. Everything that we have. And that includes our time. It includes our talents, our skills and abilities, but it also includes our finances and our resources. It all belongs to God. So I want to do the unthinkable and talk about money in church. We need to recognize that God is our provider. He is our source, and everything that we have comes from him and belongs to him. We may go to work, and our employer may hopefully pay us. But it's God who gives us that ability to earn. It's God who has created that job position for us. And if he desires, he can just as easily take it away from us. Actually, I knew a guy back in the UK, and he had come to faith in quite a remarkable way. I should say he came to faith in Jesus in quite a remarkable way. And he absolutely believed that everything that he had came from God, to the point that he sat in a meeting with his boss one day where his boss threatened him with his job, and he turned around to his boss and said, "You can't take my job from me. Only God gets to decide that." I'm like, I can't quite conceive having that kind of boldness. But that is the reality, right? Of knowing that actually your life is held in God's hands, not in the hands of those around you. God ultimately determines his provision for us. Whatever is under the whole of heaven is mine, God says. And so if we find ourselves one day without, God is able to still provide for us through other means. Matthew 25, let's turn there. Back to the Bible rather than me rambling. In Matthew 25, Jesus tells a parable about a man who entrusted some of his wealth to his servants while he went away on a journey. And in the parable, the servants are given different amounts. Verse 15 says, each according to his ability. And then when the man returns from his journey, he essentially evaluates what each of the servants has done with the money they had been entrusted with. Now, I don't have time to go into the detail of this parable today, particularly because I've been talking about stewarding time, and according to this clock, I'm not stewarding my time well this morning. But when the man returns from his journey, he evaluates what each servant has done. And what is notable is that the servants who faithfully used the money that they had been entrusted with are congratulated, and they are entrusted with more. The rich man literally says to them, verse 21, and repeated exactly the same words in verse 23, but he says, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful with a few things. I'll put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness," right? This is a parable. It's not a literal story, but it's there to illustrate something. And it's as if Jesus is giving us a picture of what it means to steward what we've been entrusted with. God has entrusted us, each with different amounts of wealth. Some of us have a little and some of us have a lot. The question is, how are we stewarding it while he's put it in our hands? Are we using it to serve ourselves? Are we hiding it away? Or are we using what he's entrusted to us to serve and further his kingdom? Now, I want to touch on as well the tithe and giving. And at some point we need to do another bit of teaching on this because there's so much more than I can cover this morning. I discovered that largely, so Christians tend to fall into two different camps when it comes to their opinion of the tithe. One is that the tithe, so giving 10% of our income, that's literally what the tithe means, it's a tenth. Some Christians believe that giving the first 10% of our income is both modeled by and required by Scripture, that is what we should be doing as Christians. There are other Christians who believe that it was part of the Mosaic law and therefore is now obsolete. So you might choose to give 10%, but you're not required to give 10%. Now, statistically, less than a quarter of Christians in North America tithe. On average, Christians tend to give 2.5% of their income, so a quarter of a tithe. And incidentally, that amount, which is pretty up to date, that is less than Christians were giving on average during the Great Depression. Our giving and our generosity as a church is actually in decline. I will say at this point, I believe that Numa is a pretty generous church. Sarah and I are constantly humbled by the way that God is providing through his people here. And so thank you for the way that you are investing in God's work through this particular body. But it is worth thinking about what is going on at large, and what's more important for us is whether we actually have a good, clear biblical understanding of giving and financial stewardship. And one author says on this that financial stewardship should revolve not around the question of how much money should I give to God, but how much of God's money do I get to keep right now? It's quite a good way of thinking about it, right? Because it immediately corrects the view that our money is ours. It's not about how much of my money am I giving, but it's how much of God's money do I actually get to keep for the moment. But I want to suggest another question that we can ask is simply, how does God want me to use the money that he's entrusted to me right now? How is he wanting me to use what he's entrusted to me right now? I firmly believe that giving is a part of what God expects with regards to our financial stewardship. It's repeated so many times in Scripture that even if you take the proportionate amount out of the equation, the very fact that we should be giving back to the work of God, back to his kingdom, out of what he's entrusted to us, I think is pretty inescapable. Philippians 4:18, Paul talks about the Macedonians, and he talks about their giving as a fragrant offering, an acceptable sacrifice pleasing to God. He's literally using terminology from the Old Testament worship to describe financial giving. So let's recognize our giving is an act of worship. It's one of the things that God wants us to do and expects us to do with the financial resource that he's entrusted to us. He wants us to give because it is an act of worship that says, I can give this back to you, recognizing that you are everything. I'm not dependent on this, and I'm not going to let this have mastery over me. So I can give freely to you, trusting that you have me, that you're my provider, that you're my source. I don't have to lean on my finances because I'm leaning on you. And when I'm leaning on you, I can actually give from my finances, however much or however little it is, I can still give it because I trust you, God. It's an act of worship that says he is worthy. 2 Corinthians 9, verse 7, Paul writes, each of you should give what you've decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. So our giving should be an overflow of joyful gratitude. We should be thankful to God for what he has given us and for what he's done for us. And there's another principle hidden in this verse, that we should give out of desire, not duty. God doesn't want us to give reluctantly or under compulsion. He wants us to give just willingly from this place of desire. I'll come back to that thought in a moment. I should have reordered these notes because I've just realized that ties in with another point, but otherwise it's going to get us out on this slide. So let me just cover the next one. Giving should also be a systematic part of our financial use and stewardship. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 16, he gives the church an instruction. On the first day of the week, each one of you should set aside a sum of money in keeping with your income. So he's talking about proportionate giving. Saving it up so that when I come, no collections have to be made. So he's saying that our giving to God should be planned, it should be systematic, it should be regular, and it should be proportionate to our income. You get the money in, this is what it means on the first day of the week. You got the money in, now the first thing that you should be doing is putting some of that aside. And you do that so that it doesn't, We don't pass an offering plate round here. But essentially, he's saying, what I don't want your giving to be is, oh, there's an offering plate coming, let me just root around and see what I have. Equally, our giving shouldn't be, well, I'll see what's happened after I've paid my bills and after I've paid my subscription services and after I've done all my groceries. No, it's the first day of the week. We make it a priority and we set something aside, and then we trust that God will cover us with the rest. There is a comment I could make about the tithe and the proportionate giving that Paul is making reference to most likely being a tithe, but we're not going to dive into that. On top of regular giving, there's a principle of additional generosity, which we see primarily in the book of Acts with the early church. Acts 2, 44, 45, all the believers were together. They had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. We see it again in Acts 4 and again in Acts 11, where the church was taking up these offerings and people were giving to serve those who were in need. Time and time again, different circumstances, but giving that was above and beyond the regular giving, using their financial and even their material resources, selling their property, selling their possessions in order to meet the needs of others, stewarding and using the wealth that had been entrusted to them in order to serve the kingdom. Then in 2 Corinthians 8, Paul holds up the Macedonian church. Again, I just made reference to the Macedonian church in Philippians, but here he's writing about the Macedonian church in his second letter to the Corinthians. And he holds them up as an example of generosity. He says, in the midst of a very severe trial, their overflowing joy and their extreme poverty, note that, they were living in extreme poverty, but it welled up in rich generosity. For I testify, says Paul, that they gave as much as they were able, and then he says, and even beyond their ability. Entirely on their own, they urgently pleaded with us for the privilege of sharing in this service to the Lord's people. It's a remarkable example here that we are encouraged to have this same kind of attitude of rich generosity that comes from overflowing joy. And then there's this recognition that giving is actually a privilege that is to be pleaded for. You know, I read that and I go, when was the last time that I pleaded for the privilege to give? When was the last time you pleaded for the privilege to give? So I'll just be honest here. I don't think I'm going to show anyone up. But I've never, in my history of church ministry, had someone run up to me and go, please let me give. Please. I desperately want the privilege of giving. Never have I experienced that. And yet this is what was being modeled by the church in Macedonia. They were pleading for this opportunity to give to someone else who was in need, to give towards the kingdom. Giving is a privilege. And we shouldn't miss that the Macedonians' generosity came out of a place of extreme poverty, and that they gave beyond their ability. I've shared before how I've experienced that in my own life, where when I was living in poverty, someone else who was also living in poverty knocked on my door one day and said, I'm taking you to the grocery store. And we grabbed 2 trolleys and we filled them with pretty much everything that she thought I could possibly need. And then she paid for it. And I don't know how. I don't know what that did to her family's financial situation, but I knew that they were not in a position barely to afford things for themselves. And yet she allowed something inside of her to well up in rich generosity that came out of extreme poverty. But God enables us to do that. And we shouldn't be shy. This is what it means to trust God with everything, to recognize that it all belongs to him. Even if we're in extreme poverty, we can give when we're prompted to, because we know that he owns a cattle on 1,000 hills. And if he's asking us to give out of our resource, he's going to ask someone else to give out of their resource to provide for us. Because it all belongs to God. I just want to come back to this point. The reason we're talking about the need for our stewardship of our time and our stewardship of our money to be habits and disciplines is because if we don't have it as a habit, if we don't have it as a discipline, if we don't train ourselves in it, we will just drift towards the way of the world that says it's all yours. Use it as you want to. Use it on yourself. But that is not a biblical view of how we should steward our time and our money. The biblical view says we need to recognize it all belongs to God. And he's entrusted it to us. And therefore he's expecting us to use it well. And we will one day stand before him and give account. Good biblical stewardship of both our time and our money, it's a way to stand up against the pressures and the patterns of this world. It's a way to stand up against the mastery of money and to submit to and be obedient to the way of God that is revealed to us in Scripture. So I want to wrap up by asking you just to consider a couple of questions, and then we're going to stand and pray together. Firstly, how are you using your time? I've already asked you that, but I want you to think about that again. How are you using your time? Are you using it to serve God, or are you using it primarily to serve yourself? Are you spending your time wisely, or are you wasting it away? Second question is, how are you using your money, your finances, your resources? Are you using them to serve God, to further his kingdom, or are you busy storing up, kind of building a store barn for yourself? Are you putting your resource towards God's purposes, or are you primarily putting your resource towards your pleasure? I want you to imagine for a moment if every Christian, and I don't mean just us, imagine for a moment if every Christian, everyone who professes to follow Jesus, was to live from this place that it all belongs to God. Imagine if every decision that we made about our time recognized that every moment belongs to God. Imagine if every thought and decision that concerned our money was founded on the reality that every penny belongs to God. How might that change the way that we use our time? How might that change the way that we use the money that we've been entrusted with? You see, following Jesus is a call to a radical countercultural way of living. It's not easy, but this is why we need to train ourselves and discipline ourselves and build these habits into our lives. Because I believe that actually if we could, as a people of God, get to a point where we recognize it all belongs to God, the church could make a massive difference. And the church would stand out from society at large in a transformative way. Because it is such a countercultural call on our lives to steward our time and our money differently. I actually believe that this is one of the ways that we can experience the fullness of life that Jesus talks about by stepping into the countercultural ways of Jesus.